Are electrons conscious? That's what supporters of so-called panpsychism believe. These individuals, such as today's guest Philip Goff, conjecture that you have to consider not only sentient beings like you and me in the consciousness project, but you also have to take into account the conscious participation of the electrons in our universe, even those electrons that are powering the very computer on which you're watching this lovely video. I had such a delight talking to Philip about his many theories, his contributions. What does he think about his competitors or his collaborators in the field of consciousness studies, from Dan Dennett to Sam Harris and Annika Harris, to those past guests on the show, such as David Chalmers and Donald Hoffman? Does reality exist without a notion of what consciousness is? Why did Galileo exclude it from the scientific process? And what can be done to rectify that? These are the topics that Phil and I discussed. You're really going to love this episode, and I hope you will subscribe and follow us on the channel for more great consciousness videos coming up as we explore the most mystifying supercomputer that sits on our shoulders, our brain, and other brains and minds throughout the cosmos. Stay tuned and come along into the impossible with me and Philip Goff.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, philosophers of all ages, you're in for a treat today. We are talking with the really renowned thinker, philosopher, author, professor, Philip Goff, who I've been trying to get on unsuccessfully for over a year on the podcast. And somehow, after I made an appearance on Lex Friedman and he made an appearance on Lex Friedman, the magic of Lex connected us, right, Phil?
Oh, it's great to be here, Brian. I had no idea you've been trying to contact me for a year. No, I mean, it wasn't Lex. I think the first I saw you pop up on Twitter DM. I had no idea you've been kind of trying to contact me for a year. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I was using your website, which has a picture of a brain. I thought, selfishly, that's a Brian, or that's a plea. It's a sign that you should be receptive to a missive from me. And I wrote you, and I think it was after you were on Michael Shermer's show over almost like 2 years ago. Yeah, but anyway, you're here now. We have an hour together. We have a ton of stuff to cover, and you're talking about my favorite scientist in history, and you're claiming that he made an error, and that's Galileo Galilei. And I want to start off with, before we do my patented judging books by the cover, where you're going to explain how you got the title and the cover design for the book, I want to start with a quote, and I want to know if you recognize this, and if this was perhaps the impetus for your assertion that Galileo made an error, a blunder, perhaps as big as could be offered. Here it goes. Okay. Is it payback for this statement made by Galileo? Okay. What is observed by us in the third place is the nature of matter, of the Milky Way itself, which, with the aid of the spyglass, may be observed so well that all the disputes that for so many generations have vexed philosophers are destroyed by visible certainty, and we are liberated from those pesky philosophers' wordy arguments. That was in a book, a little-known book called Siderius Nuncius. Tell me, my friend Phil, did you write this book to sully the reputation of a man who sullied the reputation of all philosophers?
No, I mean, I'm actually a huge fan of Galileo, and, it's a provocative title, but actually I think he had things a lot more right about consciousness issues than we do now in certain ways. And actually, I mean, he was obviously a great experimental philosopher, using telescopes to look at the stars for the first time. But actually, I mean, you have him there appearing to have a go at philosophers. But actually, one of the things I talk about in the book, I think Galileo is one of the few people to come up with a philosophical argument that convinced absolutely everybody, namely his refutation of Aristotle's view that people had believed for thousands of years, that heavier things fall faster. So, you have this myth that Galileo went to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped 2 weights. I think historians think that probably didn't happen. But actually, Galileo refuted Aristotle not with experiments, but with a purely logical argument. And so in a way, you might think not only is he an opponent of philosophers, he's perhaps the greatest philosopher that ever lived because of that argument, but also because in many ways the philosophy that lies behind the scientific revolution, we often forget there's a philosophy, a philosophical picture, a worldview behind science, and that was largely crafted by Galileo himself.
Yeah. What's so striking, and you go through that story in such amazing, wonderful detail in Galileo's error. We'll get into that. But what's always spoke loudest to me about Galileo is that he was a human being. And when you think about, like, he destroyed the confirmation bias of Aristotle, as you just pointed out. But then later in the dialogue, which I've just translated, or not translated, but we've recorded the first ever audiobook. By the time this interview with Phil comes out, I recorded an audiobook with Carlo Rovelli and Frank Wilczek and Fabiola Giannotti and many others. And that's coming out. It's the first ever audiobook by Galileo. But in that book, he makes the case for the heliocentric model of the universe, and he uses as a proof the sloshing of water as the Earth rotates around and revolves on its axis, and that's totally wrong. And yet the underlying theory is right. And I want to ask you, in other words, he was right about geocentrism being wrong or heliocentrism being right, but he used a confirmation bias error. He made an error. How is it possible that we can get things right philosophically by thinking purely philosophically, and yet be wrong at the same time? Doesn't that kind of call into question the ability of the human brain to be trusted on any level?
Yeah, it's funny how these things work out, how great leaps forward can sometimes end up being mistaken in the way they reached it, even though perhaps there was some underlying intuition or some, Galileo's principle of relativity, perhaps some deep intuition Galileo had that, you'll know the physics better than me, so I shouldn't talk about things above my pay grade, but, maybe even if he didn't get the details right, there was something right about his fundamental vision, the Copernican vision underlying this, and the mathematical picture of physics, which is mainly what I focus on in my book. But I think we all need to remember that we always think we're at the end of history. Human beings always think we're at the end of history, and before Galileo, people thought, Aristotle had basically wrapped everything up, including that the Earth was in the center of the universe, and then as things don't start to fit with the data, people try to plaster out, rather than challenging those fundamental assumptions, people try to plaster over the cracks, postulating epicycles of the planets in addition to their basic orbits, and then epicycles upon epicycles. And then, eventually this is just swept away by Copernicus's idea, and then Galileo following him. And, I sometimes think we're in a little bit of that situation ourselves now with consciousness, for example. We're just so convinced we're at the end of history and our basic worldview is correct. And when things like consciousness don't quite fit in, we try to postulate the epicycles, where maybe it's time to do what Galileo did, which is, think a little bit further, think to a kind of new paradigm, a new worldview.
Right. And, this book is just such a fascinating exploration of both how we came to know what we know about consciousness, about what we're going to get into, panpsychism, and also where we go in the future. But before we get into all the luscious topics of this wonderful book, I want to first play with you the game I play with all my authors who write books, and it's called Judging Books by Their Covers. Yeah, you're never supposed to, judge a book by its cover. But if I've learned nothing from you and my other philosopher guests like Peter Boghossian and Craig Callender here at UCSD, it's that you have to reason to the proper inference. It's the only way that you can judge a book if you don't know anything is by its cover. How did you come up with the title, first of all, and the cover design as well?
I have to confess that both of the books I've written, I didn't come up with the title for either. The title of I first wrote an academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and David Chalmers came up with the title for that. And then actually, Nigel Warburton came up with the title for my book, Galileo's Error, which is it's a kind of a similar themes, but aimed at a general audience, trying not to assume any background understanding. So Nigel Warburton's kind of a popular philosopher in the UK, one of the few philosophers who earns his money just from writing philosophy, not needing an academic post. Very lucky for some, but and he has the wonderful podcast, the Philosophy Bites, very short philosophy, 15-minute bites of philosophy, which I would wholly recommend. But anyway, he was someone who, when I was first starting to try and think about how can I communicate this to a broader audience, because there's this huge idea that's taken hold in academic philosophy, and everyone's talking about it, everyone's publishing about it, but nobody outside of academic philosophy knows what the hell it's all about. And, people care about consciousness and, neuroscience and all sorts of areas. How can I get this idea out there? And he's someone a couple of people who really helped me understand how to write more accessibly. And I remember, I sent him a chapter, and, he said, look, this is just an academic book without jargon. You need stories, you need anecdotes, and I was sort of talking about the Galileo stuff, and he said, Galileo's Error. And I guess it might have been maybe in the back of his mind. There's a book, Descartes' Error. Maybe there's some connection there. But I guess in a way, maybe the title is in a way, I think probably what Galileo did was the right decision, because it sort of put consciousness on one side for a few centuries so that we could focus on building mathematical physics. So in a way, maybe it was the right decision. But what I mean by it being Galileo's error is that he designed physical science, I believe, in such a way that it essentially and necessarily excluded consciousness from the domain of science. And I think we're now at a time in history where we need to maybe rethink that, maybe find a way of bringing consciousness back into the story of science. So that's the title. The cover. I think that the first few covers that the publisher sent, I really thought were terrible, actually. And it was someone, the designer. I looked at that. I really liked their other stuff, but I talked to my editor and my editor for the book, and I think he just put it together himself, actually. So we had the publisher had the designer make some covers, and neither of us were happy with them. I think he said, "Oh, I'm glad you didn't like it." But maybe I'm giving away some secrets here. But this is a wonderful designer. I think maybe it was just not quite what we were looking for. And so I think the editor, not a professional designer, just worked it out himself. And I think the idea was, it's kind of an eye representing consciousness. I think it's made up of fibers, maybe representing particles in some sense.
It looked like a fiber, like a particle track. Yeah. Somebody asked if it's on my YouTube channel where I solicit questions, and folks should subscribe over there. Dr. Brian Keating. I solicit questions from the audience for all my guests. And one of them was, why is the picture you have here a grid circle? That was one of the questions. So I guess we've answered that now. But let's go on to what I also don't like to do, but I feel like we have to do, because people won't really understand what is the meaning of the title without a little bit of spoilage, although it is the first chapter, so they'll have to get through the preface and buy the book to understand. I listened to the book. I love the audiobook. The reader evokes your wonderful, delightful, mercurial persona, Phil. You'll be glad to know. What is Galileo's error? What does that even mean?
Yeah, the narrator actually, I think, is the star of Grease 2, incidentally.
Oh, wow. So Carlo Rovelli, who's no stranger to Galileo, one of his books was narrated by Benedict Cumberbatch, and I just love saying Benedict Cumberbatch. But that's pretty cool. You have a Grease 2 narrator. That's amazing.
But yeah, he did a really good job. So that's, as a bit of background, I suppose a key moment in the scientific revolution is this decision of Galileo to make mathematics the language of science. And this is something like we take for granted now. I think it's kind of obvious, almost inevitable. But actually, this was a very conscious and radical decision. of Galileo to do this. And, although this is much discussed, we actually maybe ignore the philosophical work that Galileo had to do to get there. As I say, he was not just a great experimental scientist, he was also a great philosopher. This was a time when these things weren't necessarily so sharply divided. And that the trouble was, before Galileo, again, following Aristotle, people thought quite naturally the world is kind of filled with qualities. If you think about my Batman cup here, there's the blueness and the yellowness out there on the surface of the object, or the heat, the quality of heat as I touch it, smells, tastes, sounds, all these things. And I think for Galileo, the problem is it's hard to see how you can capture these qualities in a purely quantitative language like mathematics. An equation can't pin down that blueness, that quality of blueness. If there's someone who's blind from birth, you can't give them some equations and tell them about the blue. There's lots of things you can pin down about the mathematical structure of color experience, but I think there's always going to be the qualities that fill out that structure. Maybe we could argue about that. So Galileo's way of getting around this was to say, well, those qualities, they're not really out there in the physical world on the surfaces of cups. They're in the consciousness of the observer. So for Galileo, the blueness isn't really there on the surface of the cup. It's in your consciousness as you look at it, or the age-old thing. When the tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? For Galileo, no observer, no consciousness, no sound. So Galileo sort of strips the physical world of these colors, sounds, smells, tastes. What's left when you do that? Just things like size, shape, location, motion, properties quite conveniently you can capture in mathematics. So in this way, he allows us to mathematize nature, but he does that by taking consciousness and its qualities out of the domain of science. And he saw them as not in part of corporeal matter, part of the soul or the animated body. He thought that the body has a special kind of animation. This was an element actually of Aristotle. He retained. Aristotle had this idea of the soul as a sort of the form of the body. So the proper domain of mathematical physics, or what he called natural philosophy, is what we can capture in mathematics: size, shape, location, motion. And we can do that because we've taken out consciousness and its qualities. That's in the soul. That enables us to do that. So the way Galileo designs science makes it inevitable that consciousness will be excluded from the domain of science. Cut forward 400 years, Galileo's conception of science has gone so well, and people are like, "Oh my God, this is really working. This is the complete truth." I think the irony is it's gone so well precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness.
It seemed to me, reading the book, with a physicist's hat on, that it was not unlike the situation with Newton, constructing an absolute version of time. And in which events play out as time progresses, but time is somehow absolute, universal, and so forth. Was that kind of influence of Newton on Newton rather? Did that come from Galileo's perception of the thoughts on consciousness, or exclusion of it, as you say, to the to being sort of the independent variable that upon which nothing can be more primary than?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. And I mean, people might be interested. There's this collection of 19 essays from scientists as well as philosophers, including Carlo Rovelli, who you mentioned before, responding to my book Galileo's Error. And one of the contributors is Lee Smolin, who argues that it kind of agrees with me that sort of Galileo took consciousness out, but thinks that the mathematical physics that's resulted also leaves time out, real time. Obviously, you have this, physicists have this mathematical four-dimensional notion of time, but Smolin thinks they leave out the real dynamic passage of time. So I don't know. It's an interesting historical question. I mean, how Newton, his conviction about absolute time and its relationship to Galileo. My uneducated guess non-expert guess would be that absolute time is perhaps the common sense assumption. It's more something radically new that came along with Einstein, relative time, but maybe absolute time is more the common sense assumption. So maybe it was something Newton kind of focused on and made explicit, but maybe it was just something that people would naturally assume. So I mean, I'm not sure whether I agree with Smolin. I would say the reality of real quote unquote dynamic time, I would say we have to be much more agnostic about that. I mean, maybe our ordinary conception of time is just wrong, right? Maybe we should, like, I guess many people think physics has dispensed with that. I think that matters are different when it comes to consciousness, though. I think that this is why consciousness is so fascinating. Not only is it hard to fit into our standard scientific picture of things, it's also so hard to deny it exists. So this contrasts with, say, free will. A lot of people get the idea that it's hard to fit free will into our standard scientific story. And this is a big debate, but it's at least an option to say, maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe we're not really free in the way we think we are. But when it comes to consciousness, the idea that, well, nobody's ever felt pain, nobody's ever seen red or heard sound, that just seems intolerable. So that's why it's such a fascinating issue. We can't deny its existence, and yet it's so hard to fit into our standard scientific story of the universe.
Yeah, you very tenderly and interestingly point out, these concepts of emergence within physics. And I wonder, to what extent we could talk about consciousness without really understanding emergence. And I think the emergence here that I'm most interested in is how do we unify, kind of this concept of time, or can you decouple the concept of time from the concept of consciousness? Are they fundamentally intertwined? And then there are many who say time is emergent and gravity is emergent, everything's emergent. And so I guess my question, which will now devolve into a discussion about panpsychism after you hopefully can give us your favorite definition of that, will be, can we really understand, as I think Philip Morrison said, more is different. More is more, in other words, when you have a collection of individual things, they behave differently than n times those number of things. So the concrete question after this blathering on is, can we understand consciousness, time, gravity, whatever, without a real understanding of how these things emerge and what their fundamental quality is? In other words, are we, as I often accuse my colleagues who are obsessed with theories of everything, I say, why don't you work on a grand unified theory first, before you tackle all four forces, just unify the first three and, don't put the toe before the gut, I always say. So are we kind of doomed on a fool's errand because we don't understand how emergence really fundamentally works? Can we understand consciousness before we understand emergence?
That's a great question. And, on everything other than consciousness, I'd be tempted to agree with you. How we have a kind of pre-theoretical understanding of what time is, of what freedom is, of what a person is, what value is. And then you might think, why should we think those pre-theoretical, ordinary, everyday person conception of those are correct? Our ordinary concept of solidity maybe is like everything's filled in, but why think that's correct? Maybe it doesn't correspond to the reality. I think in the unique case of consciousness, things are a little bit different. And that's because I think, at least to some extent, we know what consciousness is before we do any science. So a lot of people say, it's a mystery. We don't know what consciousness is. I mean, I don't like that way of putting it. I think, in a way, nothing is more familiar than our feelings and experiences. That's all we're talking about with consciousness. Pain. What is pain? It's pain is just a feeling, and a feeling is essentially defined by how it feels, and how it feels when you feel it. Or think about a red experience. When we think about our red experiences, I need to think of different examples. But anyway, think of that, that deep red you experience as you watch a setting sun. There's a quality to that experience that fills it out. And I think we have some kind of rich understanding of what that is, just in the sense that we understand its qualitative character.
Right.
So we know something about what consciousness is from the inside, as it were. Now, don't get me wrong, I think we make all sorts of mistakes about our consciousness. The philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel has done some wonderful work pointing out the errors we make about our consciousness. But I want to say there are things we know about it before we do science, and they can't be entirely wrong. I want to say, maybe you disagree, like the way pain feels. I don't think science could ever say, oh, actually, no one's ever felt hurt. No one's ever felt hurting, that hurting quality. That's a mistake. Or, the way redness looks, the way chocolate tastes.
Right.
Scientists
it may be relative. It may be our experience may be relative. I may see and call red something, that you call red, but I may perceive it in something that if I were in your brain, you would see as green. And that's the whole Nagel thing. By the way, my dream someday, maybe you can help me, Phil, is to write a book called What Is It Like to Be Thomas Nagel, written by a bat. Anton Bat. Anyway, maybe you can help me, but that's that whole kind of perception as almost a different form of relativity. But of course, I agree with you, and I wonder if you consider this, like, have you ever met somebody who truly acts as if they don't believe they have free will? I know our friend Sabina Hassenfelder. Many people believe in determinism, super determinism, and she's going to be coming back on the show for her new book coming out later this year. But I want to ask you, have you ever met someone who acts like they don't have free will? I've never met someone, I may have acted like it, but what does it mean that people say that they believe that there's no free will and then they act purely in concert with the opposite of that conjecture?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I say it's an option to deny the reality of free will in a way that doesn't seem like an option with consciousness. Right. But can you really?
You have no choice but to deny that option.
Can you really live that out? I was actually talking to a neuroscientist, Michael Ferguson from Harvard, who visited me here in Durham recently. We're trying to make panpsychism connections, and he was talking about empirical work actually, where people who do adopt a determinist position and reject, at least on an intellectual level, reject the reality of free will, have worse well-being. So even if you can't totally live it out, just on an intellectual level, believing it lowers your well-being. I don't know whether that's true or not. But I mean, even in the consciousness case, well, my co-host of my podcast, Mind Chat, if I could just quickly plug that, is someone who says intellectually he does not believe in consciousness, at least in the way I've just been characterizing it. So, the gimmick is I think it's everywhere, he thinks it's nowhere. But so, I mean, even on the consciousness case, there are people, Daniel Dennett in certain moods, who say, it just does not exist. But, to my mind, that's a position really is the at least the position of least resort. I think we want to try and find ways of preserving both the data of empirical science, of course, but also the felt reality of our own experience, which I'm inclined to think actually is the thing we are most certain of.
Right.
I believe in an external world, but maybe I'm in the Matrix, maybe I'm just dreaming, but the idea that my feelings and experiences, I'm not really feeling anything. I don't, so I think what I want to say is the reality of consciousness as we experience it is a fundamental scientific datum in its own right. And I don't believe as a scientific community we really treat it as such, actually.
No, I don't think we do. And then there's all these canards, will typically, if someone thinks they're really sophisticated, professionals talk about, inference and reasoning, and amateurs talk about Karl Popper, right? So the canard, people say, well, how do you know, that we live in a matrix? I had on David Chalmers last month for his new book, Reality Plus. Which is not sponsored by Apple Plus, unfortunately for him, but it should be. It's a great book. And he goes through and he comes up with some probability, and we came up with an equation, which I named after him, the Chalmers equation, which is like the Drake equation, but for the probability of the number of different sentient consciousnesses in the universe. At any rate, he actually believes, with some degree of a high degree of confidence that we are likely simulated, but he's not so dogmatic, David. He's not going to beat it down your throat. He's a star in your book, right? On the other hand, you have people that are quite confident, and even in possession of some data. So now I'm thinking about Stuart Hameroff and past guest Roger Penrose. And thinking about their contributions, to the study where they have actual data from, their study of microtubules. I wonder if you could comment on these, relatively controversial figures. I know they're, probably your friends and colleagues in some sense, but what do you think about Chalmers, simulation? If you had to give it a grade, first of all, is Popper really relevant? I always say he didn't believe in falsification as absolute, but is Popper truly that relevant to the study of consciousness? We only have one mind of our own, at least. So does Popper play a role at all in the assessing the likelihood in some Bayesian sense of veracity of claims that you make or your colleagues make?
You mean Popper's idea of falsification, or
the fact that we can't falsify that we're not in the matrix?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, as you say, often I think we get crude caricatures of Popper, crude simplifications of the idea, and but I think I prefer to think more in, as you say, Bayesian terms rather than it's impossible to it's very hard to totally falsify anything. But I would rather think in Bayesian terms, like which hypotheses fit best with the evidence. It's a very difficult judgment call to make, but it's also a different question. What are the starting points for theorizing? If you're going to be a Bayesian, you've got to have your evidence. What is our evidence? I think a lot of people assume, well, it's our evidence is the empirical observation experiments, and that's definitely part of it. But as I say, I think that's not the full story, because this is this other source of evidence we have just from our immediate awareness of our own feelings and experiences. So I think, what this calls for is a radical reassessment of what we mean by what the task of science is. I think people think the task of science is accounting for the data of public observation experiments. Once you've done that, job done, we can go home. Well, because, will we ever do it? But if you religiously followed that, you wouldn't postulate consciousness, because consciousness is not something we discovered in a particle collider. It's not something we know from experiments. It's something we know from our immediate awareness of it. So this is why, Daniel Dennett is very consistent. He says, my consciousness in the sense that philosophers talk about it is not a postulation of third-person empirical science, so it doesn't exist. Whereas I'd rather go the other way and say, no, look, there's this other fundamental datum we need to account for in addition to the data of public observation experiment. So that's why, we need to think of the reality of consciousness as hard data. You talk about panpsychism or wacky theories. People say, what's the data in support of it? Well, the reality of consciousness is a data point in its own right. On the simulation hypothesis, Chalmers said to me 25% probability on our podcast.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he said on the show too. Yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting argument, and it should be thought about. I don't go for it because I don't think a simulation would be conscious. I mean, that's a huge debate. It depends on what's called substrate independence, whether consciousness is dependent just on kind of computational organization, or whether it's dependent on stuff as a panpsychist.
The it from bit, right, and the bit from it. Yeah, good point. That is, yeah. And I often think, in terms of like extrapolating artificial intelligence, and you and Lex Friedman talked about this, and you and Joe Rogan talked about this. We'll have links to all those appearances in the show notes. But I wonder often, and I've said this, I have my Einstein finger puppet. I can't find my Galileo finger puppet's in the shop. I guess I broke off that. But, do you know what Einstein called his happiest thought of his life, Philip?
His happiest thought. I remember his greatest blunder. I'm not sure the happiest thought. No.
Yes, happiest thought was that someone in free fall would experience no gravitational force.
I did know
that. Yes, I'm sure you do. Yeah, it's I shouldn't have put you on
general
the spot.
Relativity.
Exactly, which led to the equivalence principle. Very good. But I often think, well, let's examine an artificial Einstein instead of AI, right? Okay, so how could such an object or entity or being have a sensation of happiness, A, And then B, how could such a sensation of falling weightlessness, how could that, in other words, we kind of impute to and I talked a little bit with Lex about that in my chat with him. But the point is, how do you imbue these things? In other words, would we recognize it if these things were conscious? If we could create artificial consciousness, or maybe they, or if there are other consciousness things, is it possible that there's sort of like, as Paul Davies says, a shadow biosphere? Could there be a shadow consciousness that we just cannot access because we don't have those proteins, or we don't have language, or is that a possibility? That's kind of the answer to the Fermi paradox about consciousness, so to speak, of why we don't see other consciousnesses.
Yeah, well, as the thing I am most passionate about conveying, I hope people who've heard me before probably get sick to death of me saying this, is that the reason consciousnesses can't be totally treated in a normal scientific way is that it's not publicly observable. Now, yes. Scientists are used to postulating things we can't observe.
Replication.
But in this case, the thing we are trying to account for can't be observed, and can't be publicly observed. I think that is totally unique. And that's why I don't think you can pin down a lot experimentally about consciousness, but I don't think you could totally pin down the theory of consciousness with experiments, because it's not a publicly observable phenomenon. There's always going to need to be some kind of inference to the best explanation.
Yes.
And I mean, the core, I mean, what has so excited academic philosophy about this Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychism that's sort of been rediscovered? You talked about emergence a while ago. Is, the standard way of thinking about things is, how do we make sense of consciousness emerging from matter? And we get the hard problem of consciousness. No one's ever, despite our scientific understanding of the brain, no one's ever sort of come up with a good explanation of that, a good way of accounting for how consciousness emerges from matter. That what the panpsychist does is turn the explanation on its head, right? Instead of thinking how consciousness emerges from matter, let's think about how matter emerges from consciousness. And Russell's insight, the reason we can do that, coming back again to Galileo, is because physics is purely mathematical. So because physics is purely mathematical, physics just identifies these fundamental mathematical structures. So long as there's stuff that through its interactions realizes those mathematical structures, then you can get physics. So the panpsychist idea is, well, it could be consciousness stuff. We could have these networks of simple conscious entities behaving in simple, predictable ways because they've got very simple experiences. They through their interactions, they realize these mathematical structures, and that is what physics is studying. You don't know that when you're a physicist because you're just interested in the mathematical structure, but that is what you're studying. So in this way, physics emerges from facts about consciousness. So what we've got to do is, thinking in terms of inference to the best explanation, we know consciousness goes along with brain activity. What's the best explanation? I think the kind of materialist explanations of getting kind of trying to make sense of consciousness emerging from matter, it's a big argument. I don't think they work out. I don't think they've ever shown any fruit. There's this alternative explanation. Maybe physics and matter emerges from underlying facts about consciousness. And I think actually that's a much more straightforward explanation. So in the sense of inference, the best explanation, I think this looks to be the best solution to the hard problem of consciousness. That's the basic.
Let's get into panpsychism in just a second. But first, to remind the audience, we're speaking to Professor Philip Goff of, is it Durham University or University of Durham?
I'm not sure, actually. I think you could say either.
Okay, either way. And the author of the phenomenal Galileo's Error, featured on Lex Friedman's podcast, Joe Rogan's podcast. And after you go on those two kind of, up and coming stars, then you come onto the Into the Impossible podcast. But he is also a podcast host of his own. And your podcast is called Mind Chat, and you can find that wherever podcasts are sold, and even on YouTube. And so I want to turn back to lastly to the before I turn it over to my audience, questions that they've submitted via Twitter to Dr. Brian Keating and to Philip_Goff, and on YouTube at Dr. Brian Keating on YouTube. And that's another callback to our friend Galileo, who said the following. He said, the sun, with all those planets revolving around it and dependent on it, can still ripen a bunch of grapes as if it had nothing else in the universe to do. And I don't know if you've ever been to Galileo's prison in Florence, but we hosted a conference on relativity there in 2015, and it's a pretty nice prison. I think Ghislaine Maxwell and others would love to be there instead of where they are right now. But it has these grapevines and olive trees and so forth. And it's a lovely, lovely place. But he often thought and mused about wine. And he said wine is sunlight held together by water. And I want to ask you, can we learn about consciousness from the unconscious state? Thinking about the anti-consciousness, is there something that we can learn, from sort of the counterfactual? As Stuart Hameroff has claimed, he has special, kind of privileges because he's an anesthesiologist, and so he can knock people out. And I say, I knock people out all the time. Just come to one of my lectures. We'll put in a drum roll right there. But can we learn about it from its opposite, unconsciousness?
Absolutely, yeah. So, the way I think about consciousness science, consciousness research, is that there's a theoretical aspect and an experimental aspect. So the experimental task is to try and pin down what's called the neural correlates of consciousness, which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of experience, and more generally, which kinds of brain activity are necessary and sufficient for consciousness in general. That's really important data, but I think that always leaves open the more theoretical question: why do these two things go together? And there, I think we're back to the inference to the best explanation thing. It's the first time I've put it in terms of inference to the best explanation. When I was on Joe Rogan, I don't think I managed to convey to him what the hard problem of consciousness was. And I was thinking
it's the host's fault. If you can't bring out the best in your guest, you should think of another profession. Maybe like, epidemiology is what Joe should be doing. Just kidding, Joe. I loved what you did.
I was thinking afterwards, maybe I should have talked about inference, the best explanation. Maybe that's a better way to put it. But yeah,
that's exclusive.
In terms of the experimental task, yeah, it's about thinking of trying to pin down as best we can, and it's very difficult, where consciousness is and where consciousness isn't. You might think as a panpsychist, isn't it everywhere? Well, yes and no. A panpsychist thinks at the fundamental level of reality, maybe particles or fields, there's consciousness, but they don't necessarily think at the macro level it's everywhere. They would tend to think that the circumstances in which simple conscious entities combine to form complex conscious entities are maybe quite rare. Maybe natural selection has, as it were, discovered this and exploited it. So pinning this down, you need to be guided by the science. So science and philosophy really needs to work hand in hand here. And a lot of it is because it's not publicly observable. We have to do the best we can. You can ask people. You can the so-called no report paradigm. You can look for sort of external markers and
make people unconscious.
You can look where it's absent. Although then it's tricky, do people really have dreamless sleep, or is it just experience that you don't remember? Waking experience is connected up by memory second to second, whereas often when you're dreaming, it's not so much. You can be suddenly somewhere else and you don't notice. So maybe so-called dreamless sleep is just where the chains of memory collapse and you're just having streams of experience. Not knowing from one moment to the next. So it's very, very hard, even just with the experimental science.
I don't know if it's true or not, but a friend of the show, Kim Stanley Robinson, he wrote a wonderful book, which if you haven't read, it's called Galileo's Dream. You would love it because in the book, Galileo suffers from these, what they're called syncopes, which I think he did in real life, kind of fainting spells. And Kim uses that, or Stan uses that as a vehicle that really engages the concept of time travel and space travel. I won't ruin it, although it occurs very early in the book, where Galileo, during those moments of epileptic seizure, apparent to the outside observer, Galileo is actually being teleported to the future on the moon Europa that he, of course, discovered. And it goes back and forth using this vehicle of these syncopes or epileptic seizures perhaps, of unconscious to the external observer. But I wonder, it would be really fun to have you and Stan, kind of gather around and talk about these issues, because that's obviously fictional. But I think there is something that we could say as this problem of external observation, and how that may preclude you as sort of a barrier that we have to tunnel through to gain greater clarity. I'd be remiss, so like when David Chalmers was on the show, I asked him, you have to define the hard problem of consciousness, because it'd be like you go to see someone in your beloved country by the name of AC/DC, and they don't play Back in Black, or they don't play, You Shook Me All Night Long. You feel kind of ripped off. So my audience will feel ripped off, Phil, if you don't explain panpsychism.
Panpsychism. Well, I mean, in our standard way of thinking about things, consciousness exists only in the brains of highly evolved organisms, and so only exists, in a tiny part of the universe, and only in very recent history, at least in terms of the history of the universe. But for the panpsychist, consciousness pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. So it sounds kind of wacky. I mean, I suppose the thought is, you can think of it as an alternative research program, right? We've been banging our head against a brick wall for many decades now of trying to explain consciousness in terms of utterly non-conscious processes in the brain. I would argue we've done a lot that's good understanding the brain and consciousness, but in terms of explaining consciousness in terms of patterns of neural firings, I think, how the brain produces a kind of inner world of colors, sounds, smells, tastes, I think we've got nowhere with that. The panpsychist tries an alternative research program. Rather than explain consciousness in terms of the non-conscious, we try to explain very complicated forms of consciousness in terms of simpler forms of consciousness which are then postulated to exist as just fundamental constituents of matter. So that's the start of it, and the Russell stuff I talked about earlier is an important part of spelling that out in a little bit more detail.
Now, if we have a concept in physics related to emergence, but really it's mostly like linearity, I think about, let's say there is, because and I hope it's okay to criticize you with love, or not you, but the theory. The theory is, panpsychism is everything's conscious. This rock is conscious. My mouse is conscious. This mouse, not the one running around in the background. Everything's conscious. Yeah, but that's not really what it is, right? I mean, that is not a full, accurate description of panpsych. I think, by the way, it suffers from a PR problem. When you hear panpsychism, you ask someone at the checkout counter at Whole Foods, they're going to say, "Oh, it's about psychics." So I think it gets a bad rap because of its moniker. But it's not really true that everything has consciousness. Is that everything, as I understand it, participates in the conscious observer, or the process of what we deem as consciousness. Is that right? Or is it true that, electrons are conscious?
No, right. Yeah, I think there is. Yeah, I agree. Annika Harris, who's somewhat sympathetic to panpsychism, among other views, thinks something problematic about the name. I kind of think maybe we're stuck with it now. And I mean, literally, it does mean everything, mind, pan, everything, psyche, mind. But yeah, panpsychists these days, as I say, the standard view would be that the fundamental level things have consciousness. So for the sake of simplicity, we could think about fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. So the view would be that they have incredibly simple forms of experience. So we're not talking about, the kind of experience a human being has. By consciousness, to be clear, we're just talking about any kind of subjective experience. Our consciousness is very complicated, the result of millions of years of evolution. A horse's consciousness is simpler, a mouse simpler again. A bedbug, if bedbugs have consciousness, it's going to be much, much simpler. For the panpsychist, this keeps going right down to the fundamental building blocks of matter, which on the panpsychist view have incredibly simple forms of experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature. And then the thought would be, the ultimate aim of the explanatory program is to make sense of those little forms of consciousness combining together to make more complicated forms of consciousness, and we thereby ultimately get an explanation of the consciousness of humans and other animals that we're pre-theoretically committed to. I mean, I'm just seeing as I'm talking to a physicist, I'm oversimplifying by talking about particles, but there are also, field-based versions of panpsychism, and maybe even, the conscious wave functions, or so. So often it's put in terms of conscious particles, but that's just sort of for ease of exposition, I think.
Great.
So just Chad, so it doesn't literally mean every combination of particles is conscious in its own right. So this cup might not have its own consciousness. It's just made up of little things that are conscious in some very, very simple way.
Right. Yeah. And again, just because something has the name, consciousness. I mean, again, physicists used to be called natural philosophers, used to have, physicians and so forth used to be physicists. So yeah, just the name shouldn't be, construed as a shibboleth or some anchor around the field. But yeah, I agree. It would be great to sort of modify it at some point. But we've got so many questions from the audience. I feel and I hope that we can do a part two someday, but I do want to get to a couple of them just while I have you here, and who knows what the future will bring. Hopefully it'll bring you to America at some point and me to the UK, and we can do this in person. But the first question comes from a fellow, he's a member of Great Britain, at least I think you guys are still unified in Scotland, and that's a man by the name of Lee Cronin. Also guest on Lex Friedman's show, also past guest on my show. And Cronin criticized panpsychism today on Twitter by saying panpsychism appears to not be a real thing. It has no conceptual or philosophical or cultural meaning. It just reflects the void in our understanding, which should be filled by more sensible discourse. I'm happy to be wrong, but tell me why. And he sends you his love and affection, by the way.
Thanks, Lee. That's great. Yeah. Oh, I saw that on Twitter this morning. I didn't realize it was connected to this. That's great. So again, I guess it's a couple of things. I suppose in some ways I'm repeating what I've already said, but part of this is, I think, we have, in contrast to other cases, we have some grip of the phenomenon of consciousness before we do the science. So we've got an explanandum, something that needs explaining. Whereas, contrast with anything else, we don't know what the hell the thing is before science tells us. What is this stuff? Maybe it's a fundamental element, as the Greeks thought. Science comes along and tells us it's H2O, or when you see lightning in the skies, maybe it's the anger of the gods. Science comes along and tells us it's electric discharge. But with pain, I think we already have a somewhat of a grip on what it essentially is. We're talking about things that are defined by how they feel, and we know how they feel, or defined by the character of the experience, and we know the character of the experience, at least to a rough approximation. So that's an important part of why I think this is a very, very different to other scientific cases. And then, I suppose that there's no explanation. I think there are now detailed explanatory, detailed explanatory claims about how exactly, if you might want to look at my paper on my website, how exactly does panpsychism explain consciousness, where I try and lay out a detailed explanation of how, an empirically credible explanation of how human consciousness emerges from consciousness at more fundamental levels. And it's going to work, as I say, hand in hand with the experimental science. Another really good panpsychist, Hedda Hassel-Merck, spent a year with Giulio Tononi spelling out in her panpsychist terms the integrated information theory. So the two are going to work together. But I think there are detailed explanatory views here. So I suppose I'd want to say, well, tell me what's in the details, what's going wrong there. And maybe what puts people off is because, as I say, because consciousness is not publicly observable, there's always going to be, it's not going to be totally pinned down by the data. You can't look in a quark and see if it's conscious, just as I can't look in your head and see if you're conscious. So it's always going to be a role for inference to the best explanation, even once all the data's in. And we're just going to talk about, but I think it's, in a way, it's easy because I think the materialist doesn't have an explanation. It doesn't have a solution. They often admit that. I have a lot of friendly arguments, strong but friendly arguments, with the neuroscientist Anil Seth, who says, look, we don't have an explanation to the hard solution to the hard problem of consciousness, but his view is just ignore it and it'll eventually go away. I sometimes call this ostrich materialism. You stick your head in the sand. So materialism doesn't have an explanation. Panpsychists have all these now pretty detailed explanations. What's not to like? And that's where I think you get Panpsychism spend a lot of time sort of just justifying its existence. But what's happening now is people just getting on with the research program, scientists and philosophers coming together to see what fruit is yielded from this. And that's what's really exciting, I think.
Amazing. Okay, well, one last question because I can't resist. This is from Eugene Bird on my YouTube channel, Dr. Brian Keating. Professor Goff is fascinating. His ideas about cosmology, but his accent and his manner of dress give him movie star potential.
Oh my God.
I would like to know whether or not his theory on the possible origin of the universe has shifted or not. So if you could briefly address that. I'm actually not familiar with your theory on the possible origin of the universe.
I thought he was going to say, but his accent and dress is ridiculous. I didn't get the movies.
You've got a fan here.
I'm a bit blushing now. I don't know what maybe what he has in mind. Maybe I've sort of I've had some speculative ideas about explaining the fine tuning. The surprising discovery that that it seems that, for example, the cosmological constant has an unexpected value, and that it's so very small but non-zero, but it also seems kind of like a number of constants in physics seem kind of there's just the right values for life, falls in a narrow range. Some people postulate God to explain this. Some people postulate the multiverse. I used to think, it's probably the multiverse, but actually it's a big story. But I've actually come to think that the inference from the whole anthropic reasoning that justifies the move from fine-tuning to multiverse, I think is a bit fallacious. So I was messing around with this idea, well, look, if we've already got a conscious universe, maybe it's sort of fine-tuned itself. Maybe we can make sense of some kind of goal-directed activity at the level of fundamental physics. And actually, I'll be talking about this. I'm currently writing a book where I might sort of explore this a little bit more. So, I feel very silly talking about it, and culturally it seems preposterous to me. But I don't like the God option. I don't like the multiverse option. There does seem to be this fine-tuning problem. So maybe a conscious universe that designed itself is the one to go for, even though I feel very silly saying it.
Well, that's lovely, and appreciate the compliments there, Eugene. Okay, we'll have to come back to part 2. We've got about 50 other questions, Phil, so if someday you're willing to come back on, I would be most delighted to host you and answer remaining questions, and maybe we'll do a friendly debate with David and Stuart Hameroff or folks like that. But for now, I'm wondering if you are willing to go and play the game that we call the Thrilling 3. Okay, these are my existential questions designed to elicit from my guest the stuff that matters most in life, which is your wisdom, not just your knowledge. I think you've impressed the universe and my fans especially with your knowledge. But let's talk now about wisdom and start with the very first one of all, which has to do with your departure from this mortal coil, as the bard once said, and that has to do with when you depart at age 120 or later, perhaps, and you get uploaded to the great cloud, perhaps. What wisdom or knowledge would you want to impart in your so-called ethical will? What is in your ethical will?
I think one thing I'd say is that I've already touched on is never assume you're at the end of history. I think this is a perennial problem with humans. We always think, we've got it all sorted now, and something always comes along and starts to show cracks, consciousness, maybe this fine-tuning stuff, and we try to plaster over the cracks, but always be open to the possibility that your fundamental assumptions are just wrong. And, thinking more kind of the meaning of life and so on, I've come to think, it's hard to be happy if you approach things saying, what's going to make me happy? What do I want out of life? I kind of think you have to find something bigger than yourself that you're going to live for, whether it's God or socialism or the advancement of science or curing cancer or something. I think in my experience, real happiness comes from finding something bigger than yourself that you can live for the sake of. And I think that's very important.
Indeed it is. And the next question has to do also with the future, but not your immediate future, but rather the future of our species, the universe, perhaps. And that has to do with sort of the knowledge or wisdom you would put in on your monolith. And you might know in Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, featuring a conscious artificial intelligence by the name of HAL. I'd love to get your opinion on HAL someday. But these are monoliths that appear throughout the show, beginning in the African savannah and progressing to the moon. And we don't know what they are. They could be time capsules. They could be warnings. They could be just whatever, giveaways left, or the future equivalent of a CD-ROM. Who knows? What would you put in it to express what scientists in your field have discovered that would be most impressive to an alien civilization?
I think I'm going to have to say the thing I'm most passionate about, which is that the reality of consciousness is a fundamental scientific datum in its own right, over and above the data of public observation and experiments. I think this is something we still haven't totally got on board with as a scientific and philosophical community. I believe we will do at some point, and I think it's going to totally revolutionize how we think about the world, how we think about science and its relation to human knowledge. So if the aliens see that, they'll say, all right, they've moved on from that materialist phase. They're doing okay.
All right, Phil. Well, the last question involves the past, not the future. And this has to do with what is known as Sir Arthur C. Clarke's third law, which states the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture beyond them into the impossible. That's the origin of the name of this podcast. I want to ask you, Phil, what mysterious aspect of life might have perplexed you or given you some concern or trouble as a 20-year-old, but now makes sense, and give yourself kind of the advice to your former self that would give you the courage to do as you've done, to go into the impossible?
I think I would say to my younger self, the long, dark night of the soul doesn't last forever. I think I've had a lot of, the theory doesn't work. You discover this just doesn't work at all. And you think I'm going to have to, or writing my popular book trying to write for a general audience for the first time and getting these responses saying, this is not a book for a general audience. Or, when I was David Chalmers' postdoc, I'd work a couple of months on a theory and he'd come up with an objection that destroyed the whole paper. And so, those things feel devastating at the time, but often they're, the things that are most important for bringing you to a better place. So I like the phrase from Samuel Beckett: try again, fail better. I think that's
yes.
The other thing that's been an important realization for me, I think, is also try to get in the mindset of people you disagree with. I think at one stage as a young man, I was trying to win the argument, you're an idiot, but then really getting curious about, trying to look out of the eyes of the person you're arguing about. Well, why are they thinking these crazy things? Trying to get inside their head. Yes. And sometimes you can change your mind, but even if you don't, I think it inevitably leads you to a deeper understanding of your own view. And so, that's so important to try and understand the people you disagree with.
Well, it has been a great pleasure coming to understand you a little bit more. Plug yourself for just a second. Where do people find you on Twitter and your podcast and elsewhere?
Yeah, I'm always arguing with people on Twitter. Philip_Goff, Philip with one L, Goff, Goff. PhilipGoffPhilosophy.com website. I got lots of things there, academic and otherwise. Mind Chat, my podcast where we interview scientists and philosophers. We had a great one about free will today with a very good philosopher who believes in free will. And there's a blog there on my website I linked to. My book, Galileo's Error, I guess.
Yes, of course. Wonderful. Well, Phil, I want to thank you so much. It's been such a delight, and I hope that you'll agree someday to do a part 2, and hopefully you'll be in the chat room when we actually air this live, or air the recording of it in real time, you'll be in the live chat interacting and hopefully passing the Turing test.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I can't believe, I didn't realize at all you tried to contact me a year ago, and I'm so glad we finally connected up.
It was meant to be. It was meant to be, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Congratulations, you made it through all the way to the end. And I hope if you did, that means that you love topics such as this. We're going to have many more in the coming months. You're going to want to subscribe to the channel. And if you're particularly interested in concepts such as the brain, consciousness, reality, I hope you'll click here for the special playlist that I curated just for you. It has my greatest hits with past guests like Don Hoffman, David Chalmers, Sir Roger Penrose, and many, many others. So make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Would you like to see more of these videos about the brain, the 3-pound supercomputer that sits on our shoulders? Let me know in the comments below.